Right. Let me start by saying that this video isn't going to talk about why one game is better than the other. The point of this video also isn't to discuss the different design decisions and criticize them, though that will be a part of it as well, but only as a means to an end. That end being to hopefully convey what, in my opinion, the two communities can learn from one another with regards to gaming. Also to clarify, this isn't strictly about changing your opinion. People have different tastes, and if you like playing a certain way, don't let my thoughts here make you feel like I don't want you enjoying playing games your way. In fact, the point of this video is exactly to promote accepting different playstyles. Finally, while I'm addressing gamers here, for the most part, there are some points that I believe developers should heed as well. Alright, that's it for the intro. I never thought of myself as one of the best gamers out there. I never claimed to be a god gamer or whatever, but I used to very much be a min-maxing kind of gamer, and I would always play on the hardest difficulty settings. Though I usually still do, but that depends on the genre. I mostly play RPGs and strategy games, and I'm much better at RPGs, so I'll almost certainly crank that difficulty up when playing those. I used to force myself to play strategy games on highest difficulties as well, and I'd rather stop playing the game entirely than give up on the difficulty, which is something that I absolutely don't do anymore. A few years ago, probably in 2018, but certainly in 2019, I noticed that I just don't have fun playing games anymore, at least in the way that I've been playing them. They were either too easy or I couldn't get immersed in them anymore, so I just sort of forced myself to stop thinking in that min-maxing way. And in 2019, World of Warcraft, or WoW, Classic got released, which is how I know I made that mental shift that year at the latest. In keeping with my min-maxing, meta-slave mentality, I used to think that people who don't run their meta-spec are bad gamers. I'm not particularly confrontational, so I never bothered anybody for it, but I sure as hell thought that they were bad gamers, or something like that. Well, in WoW Classic, I didn't care about that stuff anymore. I didn't care if anybody ran a suboptimal spec, or even if they played a meme spec. I myself played off meta as an arcane mage until fire became viable, but even then I was considering pushing through Molten Core and Blackwing Glare as fire, which, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly bad idea since those two raids being endgame content where the presumably truly difficult encounters are full of fire resistant and even fully fire immune enemies. Which of course means that fire mages are, in those places, basically useless. Point being, I forced myself to play off meta for a while, and even when I moved to the meta spec, I really only did it since a fire mage is my favorite class in Classic WoW to begin with. And I had so much fun playing with that mentality, I can't even put it into words. I was also fortunate enough to find a guild that would allow non-meta specs in their raids. I'm sure some of you watching this remember all the discussions surrounding Classic WoW before it released, whether it's going to be harder or easier than a retail WoW. Well, I pretty much knew that Classic is much easier than a retail/modern World of Warcraft, so when those first raids got cleared within, if I remember correctly, a week of Classic's release, I wasn't surprised at all. In fact, I was more shocked at how many people were surprised that Ragnaros, the boss of the first quote-unquote proper raid, that being Molten Core, got killed so fast. And if I had gone into Classic World of Warcraft with my old mentality of being a meta slave and a good gamer, not one of the best like I said before, but still pushing myself, I wouldn't be surprised to not get the world first kill, but I sure as hell would feel absolutely humiliated for only being around level 15 at the time. Level 15 out of 60 that is. Granted, if I had gone in with that mentality, I would have been pushing myself to level faster as well, so it's not a fair comparison, but I'm sure you get my point. So, eventually I hit level 60, I had a great time leveling slowly, reading all the quest texts, doing my professions, and then the endgame happened. Like I already said, I had the good fortune to join a guild that allowed off-meta builds. Not only that, but they also didn't insist of going into raids with all the different world buffs, full pre-beast gear, pre-beast meaning the best gear you can get before doing raids, fully enchanted gear, and I don't know what else. And those raids were some of the most fun I had gaming ever. I don't know if it was the most fun, but damn is it up there on the list. Yes, sure, we didn't clear Molten Core in 30 minutes or all the different raids within 2 hours or whatever different times people had, but we had a great time and it didn't require us to not play the game in order to save all the different buff timers. Also, let me clarify, when I say we had off-meta builds, I believe among all the Retribution Paladins and Shadow Priests, we also had some Balance Druids and even a melee hunter. And yes, we still managed to clear all those raids in Vanilla Classic. I remember when we got our first kill of the Twin Emperors, one of the most difficult encounters in Vanilla, I felt so good and had that adrenaline running through me that I never felt before playing WoW. Bear in mind, I started playing back in Vanilla in 2005, but I was so young back then I never got to 60 in Vanilla and I only hit 70 during late TBC being the first expansion, which is when I did my first few raids, but because it was so late in the expansion, I wasn't pushing any content anymore, and then finally in Wrath of the Lich King, I started getting into the whole meta slave mentality, so that was around 2009. Now, I hope you see where I'm going with this story. Vanilla WoW, and probably all the way up until Cataclysm. Bear in mind, I stopped playing Classic WoW in early Wrath of the Lich King, so I can't speak for anything beyond Naxxramas. Naxxramas, being the first raid in Wrath of the Lich King, can be challenging and incredibly fun if you just let yourself play the game the way you want to. Again, like I said at the beginning, de gustibus non est disputandum. If you enjoy clearing content as fast as possible and getting those damage or healing numbers as high as possible, absolutely feel free to do so. But I cannot believe that I am the only person in the world that used to think I have to play in the most optimal way possible while not playing a character in an RPG game the way I wanted to. But that is because, in a way, I couldn't. Not in most modern games that I've played. Granted, last time I read it in modern World of Warcraft was in Legion. Not sure what is considered modern nowadays, but for me, anything after Wrath of the Lich King is modern. I won't go into why here, as it's not really relevant, and at that point, you could no longer tailor your character. Talent points got completely changed from what they used to be, and you could change them pretty much on a whim, which means they are no longer defining your character, as you were expected to always use the optimal spec for the current situation. For example, if you're clearing groups of mobs or enemies, you have to optimize for area of effect or cleave, and if you're fighting tough enemies or bosses, you have to optimize for single target damage. And you're guaranteed to get the loot with the attributes your character wants, outside of secondary stats. I also won't go into the difference between the two, because really the point is, the game itself started preventing you from expressing your character how you wanted to, which quote-unquote hardcore gamers and min-maxers don't care about, but it started pushing quote-unquote casual gamers out. At least, I believe that's partially why World of Warcraft player base started dropping. Of course, it's not just that, but again, at least partially. All of these factors, the game by design pushing you towards optimal builds, and more of the player base itself being min-maxers, it really became impossible to play off-meta. People just wouldn't let you into their group even if you weren't pushing the latest, most difficult content, whether that was Mythic Plus or Mythic Rating or whatever. I believe because that mentality got so prevalent, it was really hard to find people that would allow off-meta even in easier content, further pushing so-called casuals out of the game, further optimizing the fun out of it, basically forcing players to play meta specs even in normal difficulty rates, and later in Classic WoW. So you might be wondering, how do Dark Souls or Soulsborne games come into this, or maybe you already figured it out. Dark Souls community feels like the complete opposite of WoW's community. I'm sure even if you've never played a Souls-like game, you are aware of the reputation that those communities have. People telling other people not to use certain items, not to use certain builds, or even that by leveling up you're, quote-unquote, not playing the game the way it's meant to be played. And isn't that exactly diametrically opposed from what the WoW community expects from its players? In World of Warcraft, if you don't use everything that you can to your advantage, you're a bad player. In Souls-like, the more advantages you use, the worse you are, according to these people. I say according to these people because I realize, especially lately, that they don't represent all players. These are usually just the hardest fans of the game and therefore the loudest. The people that just enjoy the game however they want don't really talk about it that much or care how other people play, which is a luxury that MMOs such as WoW don't offer. Now, here's a question for everybody, even if you don't complain about how other people play. Why is using different sorts of advantages not considered skillful? Maybe I'm not alone in my view here, but it certainly seems to me like people don't consider figuring out good or even optimal builds as a part of a player's skill set anymore. Either you execute the mechanics correctly/perfectly, or you're not skilled. I suspect the reason why people don't think making the optimal build is a skill anymore is because nowadays you can just look them up. Even when figuring out what stat allocation is best for a certain build, you can just use the tool to calculate what works best, which I actually think is a valid argument, but only because in WoW and other such MMOs, such meaning those where pretty much only the endgame content matters, the community, and as I discussed before, the game itself basically expects you to play one of those optimal builds. But that doesn't really apply to Dark Souls or Elden Ring, because they're mostly single player games and multiplayer in those games is mostly relegated to PvP, which is more a matter of pure mechanical skill, something which I think Classic WoW actually does poorly, and I can't really speak for modern WoW's PvP as I hardly participate in it. But I digress. What I'm trying to get at is that Souls-like games are, for the most part, incredibly easy. I haven't played all of them, truth be told, I'm not exactly a fan of the genre, but I have played through some of Elden Ring and I have beaten Dark Souls 3, including all the optional bosses. Now, when I say that it's incredibly easy, I'm not saying I finished it with one hand tied behind my back while blindfolded and every time I take a step in-game I get poked with a hot rod, but it is easy. Really, the only mechanic you have to learn is how to dodge. I know there's people that argue you have to learn how to parry as well, but from my playthrough, I don't know if I parried even 5 times. So, all you have to learn is when to dodge and when to attack, and that is why you can beat the whole game as a level 1 hobo wearing nothing but a big stick. And I agree in that finishing the game like that, especially if you don't even get hit once, is very impressive, but the fact that people use such measures as mark of true skill, in my opinion, shows that a game is fundamentally easy. While it may be easy, however, it is also incredibly punishing. I think people believe that because the game is so punishing that it is difficult, but that's not how I interpret the difficulty of a game. Whenever you die, there's the potential of losing progress, and you pretty much always lose some progress, depending on how many enemies respawn, but that doesn't make encounters themselves hard. I have also played through The Witcher 2's insane difficulty, which is still very, very easy, but that difficulty is even more punishing than Souls-like games' difficulties. So, here is my argument. Because Dark Souls and games like it, with the exception of Sekiro, which is a much harder game, but also much better in my opinion, are so easy, they allow you to play through them however you like. These games actually allow you to tailor your character however you want, and you can compensate for your bad build by learning the attack pattern of every enemy and every boss in the game, or you can sort of brute force through those encounters that give you trouble by increasing your stats or getting better gear. This, I believe, is incredibly important in RPGs, though how much of an RPG Souls-like games really are is something I'd also like to discuss sometime, and it is something that games like Modern WoW miss. Although that is not exactly true, as I mentioned before, this is mostly, or might mostly, be the fault of WoW's community. Yes, the raiding community generally expects players to possess the best, most optimized gear and talents. However, I believe that lower difficulty rates don't necessarily require that level of preparation. Since I haven't participated in raids outside of LFR for a while, I can't comment on it with certainty. As someone who now feels like an outsider to the raiding scene, I can only share what I perceive to be the expectations for joining even a normal raiding guild. Which means that I might not be able to play the class/talent combo that I truly want, while in Classic WoW I was able to do just that. Though, again, that was mostly down to being lucky enough to find a community that did not give a shit about clearing everything in 20 minutes. Conversely, in Dark Souls, yeah, like I said, you can get through the game as a naked hobo, sure, but you can also play as your stereotypical knight, or maybe a lightly armored warrior, or you can use a long range and a melee weapon. They might not be optimal builds, but who cares? I mean, yeah, okay, people will tell you that you don't play the game in the most hardcore way possible, but so what? If you let go of that hardcore gamer mentality, I promise to most of you, you'll have way more fun playing games again. And let me repeat this, I am absolutely sure that there's some of you out there that are actual hardcore gamers in that you really enjoy playing games in this way, which is great, more power to you. But if you're not it, like I wasn't, then don't push yourself through it. To wrap all of this up, I hope you see what I'm trying to say, the two communities can learn from each other. To the WoW community, isn't it more impressive to clear a raid with a suboptimal group? Either a group that doesn't have the correct composition or doesn't have all the best gear possible before entering that raid? And to the Souls-like community, why isn't using different advantages at your disposal a part of a player's skill set? Now, before I finish this thing up, I want to make something very clear. I do believe that MMOs need some sort of content that does require you to do pretty much everything optimally and is very difficult. I believe MMOs need that sort of content so that the people that do it get bragging rights and other players have either something to aspire to or know that there's this part of the game out there that they probably won't ever see, at least until the next expansion or whatever. I believe that because this sort of content that only very few players reach makes the game feel much bigger for that remaining vast majority of people. The way the current WoW difficulty in raids works, that effect isn't exactly reached, but there's a lot of problems with the modern WoW's world design that I won't go into here. For my point, I just want to say that yes, mythic raids should be incredibly difficult, while lower difficulties should be much more accessible, and like I said previously, they very well mathematically might be, but from my perspective, the community acts like they need all the best specs and gear to clear them. Or, to put it simply, I believe the hardest difficulties should be so hard that players need to play and have their characters set up optimally. However, that should not be required and therefore expected of players in lower difficulties, thus allowing for that role-playing part in the MMORPG. I have been talking about WoW and Soulsborne games here because it's truly fascinating how the two communities are polar opposites of one another, and once I noticed that, it made me think about this whole issue and the current gaming culture, at least as I perceive it from online discourse. But this argument can be applied to many different games and even genres. For example, even my favorite game, which, if you know it, you might have figured out what it is from my channel profile, Gothic 2. Gothic 2 is great. It's easy enough that you can play either optimally, going into one playstyle and just focus on that, or combine different skills, go for a crossbow and a two-handed weapon, or go for a sort of battle mage playstyle. Whatever. Gothic 2's expansion, Night of the Raven, however, basically forces you into playing one style and one style only, either melee or ranged, and if you play a mage, you have to know exactly which spells to go for, and you'll usually want to just go for summons anyway, so you're more or less stuck with a sort of necromancer playstyle. A lot of people think this expansion is a huge upgrade from the base game, and I think it is too, but the way they reworked how character levels up in that game is a huge step down. I mean, Gothic is also an RPG, so making a bunch of builds basically non-playable is a huge faux pas. As for an example of how optimizing the fun out of a game is bad in a different genre, think about Europa Universalis 4. I won't go into it here. If you know it, if you play it, you can deduce what my argument about it is from what I've said up to this point. Besides, I might make a rant about it in the future as well. Alright, I hope I have convinced you to at least try playing games without strictly adhering to guides or social pressure, or internal pressure for that matter, though naturally it's usually still social pressure that we have just internalized. But ideally, I have also convinced you, if you play WoW, to give people that don't push top-end content a chance, let them in your normal raiding group, or maybe even your heroic raid group, and fuck it, challenge yourself to clearing it with a suboptimal group. That is also an achievement in itself, even if it's not recognized by the game. And if you're a die-hard Souls-like gamer, I hope I have convinced you to at least not give players a hard time online for playing however they want to play, because I'm sorry, but Dark Souls and Elden Ring are both incredibly easy and nobody cares that you can beat them blindfolded while being tortured.